Hello and welcome, everyone. This is the API Hangout. Today, we are celebrating the 50th edition of the API Hangout. It has been quite the journey. I'm your host, Budha, product evangelist at Tyke. And over the course of these 50 episodes now, which started way back in April 2021, it's been more than a year and a half since we've been running these. We've now built a community which is over 3,000 strong, which is amazing. Thank you so much for all of your support. It's been a fantastic experience. It's been a great learning journey for me as well. It was early days at Tyke when I kicked this off, and now we've had discussions across all of the different things that you can imagine when it comes to APIs, whether that is open standards that we've spoken about, or open API specification, API security, governance, specific verticals, if you are interested, whether it's financial services, medical, educational, all of those different things. There are so many things to talk about. There's so many conversations that we've had. We've had special guests here who've given their opinions on things like API design. James Higginbotham comes to mind, who had a fantastic session with us. But throughout all of this, it's been you, the audience, who's been the source of our inspiration, the source of our motivation that's kept us going and been interacting with us throughout these different sessions. And that's what the point of this API Hangout is. We pick up topics, hopefully, which you will find relatable, something that you will find useful to implement in your business if you're not already doing so, or to find out a little bit more if you are already implementing it in your business. So with me today to join us for today's discussion, which I will reveal in a bit, is Yaara, who is our head of developer experience. Hello and welcome, Yaara. It's really, really good to have you.
Hey, hello, everyone.
Fantastic. And with us also is Iris, who is joining us as our user researcher. Hello and welcome, Iris.
Hi, thank you for having us.
So the reason why we've got two researchers, one head of developer experience and one user researcher, is because today's topic really goes into all about experience, specifically developer experience. So the topic was, well, we looked at developer experience across the board during our research. Let me share the screen if I can find it. And while I'm talking about it, so we were doing that across a few different use cases and trying to figure out, what's going right, what's going wrong, what is going to work for us and what isn't going to work for us. And we came to the conclusion that DX is actually part of a larger picture, and we'll be discussing that with people today. I think to just give the context and set the scene a little bit, the key thing to note here is what developer experience is. We'll talk about what it isn't, what people are getting wrong, and how you as an organization can think and plan and build for great DX based on some examples from the outside world, and maybe some of the ones that aren't really, really great examples either. So developer experience is basically the overall experience, feelings, perceptions, whatever you want to call that a developer has while interacting with a technical product. Now, this is a bit of an oversimplification for sure, but really the idea is how easy it is for a developer to interact and develop or build out APIs with your technical product, essentially. So there are a few different phases of this. There is onboarding, there is retention, there are a few different things to take into consideration. But as a simplified notion, that's the overall experience the developer has while interacting with a technical product. And since this is the topic that we are going to be going after, that's kind of the big reason why we have our head of developer experience. We've built out this function over the course of a couple of years now. And we are continuing to research how things would look like and how we can make life easy for the different stakeholders that are associated with our product. Now, typically, the thing that I'm just going to, again, as part of setting the scene a little bit, the thing to note here is there are three key stakeholders to consider. Again, maybe a bit of a simplification, but three key stakeholders that I would want to talk about. One is the developer who's building out the APIs, of course. The other is the end user, the consumer, who's going to be consuming the API and perhaps building out their product. End users can also be developers, external developers, but I'm just considering them as users themselves. And then finally, the API providers, or the organization that is going to be providing the API for a specific reason. And there are, if you think about it from a circular perspective or like a box perspective, there is the why, the what, and the how, where you think about the organization, the API providers, thinking about the why of the existence behind the APIs. The consumers are looking at what value they are achieving or receiving from those APIs. And then the developers are looking at how they can make all of that possible in the simplest possible way. And that's where DX comes in. So with that set up, hopefully not overly complex, I thought we would go into the discussion of today. So taking it straight up to Yaara, I think there are a few different misconceptions when it comes to DX, and we found some of those potentially. Chief among which is DX is all about, it's purely tools and documentation. So I wanted to get your thoughts on what DX is and how you would say, what do you think people are getting wrong? What are some of those misconceptions associated with developer experience that you think, in your opinion?
Okay, thank you first of all for the intro. I think that if you Google developer experience, you will find lots of content that it's really hard to describe DX in one word or even 3 words. So when I started, I did a lot of research, and the way I see developer experience is basically it has the productivity. It's a combination of 3: productivity, enjoyment, and success. So basically users want to, or you want to give your users to help them with reducing frictions, to automate tasks that they have, like that has many steps, or maybe automate tasks that many of your users do. It might not be heavy, but all of them are doing this, and it's quite error prone. And you basically want to help them to avoid that, and you basically also want to lower barriers for your product. And all this actually leads to the second one, that enjoyment, because when they enjoy the product. Users, like when they talk about, for example, Stripe, users love it and they use it. That's why they stick around. So enjoyment is really important. And the last one is success. So it's really a bit underestimated, I think, the sense of success. It's like, think about what you feel when you take a photo using an iPhone. Everyone feel like, oh, I'm such a good photographer, right? It's like, I'm amazing. And they know to make you feel like that. And it doesn't matter who's doing that. And obviously it's like all the image processing. But even though that you know it, you still feel, I did so well. And that is the sense of success. So I think when engineers can build amazing applications based on your toolings, they will stay around because their users will ask more. So they need that more. And so this is like the way we see it or what we want to give our users in Tyke. So this is it. And
sorry, I'm just going to piggyback on one of your points there, because enjoyment is such an interesting thing, because it's sometimes quite hard to quantify something like enjoyment, because productivity sometimes you can quantify, right? Success potentially you can quantify, because if you have a job to be done, you achieve that, you've quantified that, right? Enjoyment is probably the most interesting one there, because it's very hard to quantify something like that. Yet it is one of the most important things, because if you think about it, one of the things that we see when, especially in user research, and again, Iris, feel free to jump into this, where if you're building out user experience or an interface specifically, there is a notion of the actual speed of an interface versus the perceived speed of an interface, which can be very, very different. So ultimately, what a lot of users tend to care about is the perceived speed, where, because speed ultimately of an interface can be quite relative. The way you are accomplishing tasks, it's a relative notion in most cases. For me, a 5-second, something that takes 5 seconds to complete is fast. For someone, that bar might be much lower, that I want to have something responding to me within a few milliseconds. So that perception of speed can be quite different. And curious, Iris, in terms of, thinking about the enjoyment factor and the perception of speed, anything interesting that you've come across, or, anything quantifiable that you might have come across there?
Like from a user experience perspective, because, I can speak for user experience, user experience focuses, or customer experience focuses on the end users, whereas developer experience is about developers who make use of the software in order to implement a solution for their end users. So I think at Tyke, we try to better implement developer experience for developers in order to provide good user experience for their end users. And we provide best developer experience when we think of the developers as our internal customers or our primary set of customers. And that's what gives us that competitive advantage to create that ripple effect on their end users. And when we think of the developers as our primary users, then DX is essentially a kind of user experience as well. So when you talk about speed, yeah, I do quite think that in terms of like, that doesn't even just come down to developers. Anything that we do, I think everyone's patience with right now is quite low. Like everyone wants everything at the click of a button, or they want it within a few milliseconds. So if it doesn't happen at that, within that specific amount of time that you think it should happen, then people get frustrated, or it could lead to dropout rates. So yeah.
But I think that I agree with that, because I think that's my level of patience in most cases. But I'm working on, say, a couple of data science projects, for instance, where you have to crunch big data. And over there, that program could be taking a while to come up with, tracking that model and making those predictions if I'm looking for, predictive modeling of my data. So over there, again, that's kind of like that expectation versus reality kind of a thing that sets in, where my expectation is I know for a fact that it's going to take a little bit of time. Therefore, I'm a little bit more forgiving when it comes to that interface or what response I'm getting. Whereas on the other end, when I'm interacting with, say, either Tyke, for instance, because I know Tyke is a fast performant application that I'm expecting things to move a lot quicker versus something like on an R Studio, for instance, where I know it's crunching a lot of numbers.
On that, I think like I might be jumping the gun here and not talking about good or bad DX, but I think that comes down to like something that I want to talk later was like about mental models. So a good developer experience, something that paves way for good developer experience, which uses strong user experience principle, is adhering to a developer's mental model. So adhering to what they might be familiar with in terms of industry standards.
Maybe just explain what it means for a second.
Like what is intuitive for them, like something that they're expecting in terms of industry standards, or what are they expecting? If it comes across as something that they're not expecting at all, then they're completely thrown off. Like, for example, an example I can think of is several months back at one of our UX critique, I think, Yaara, you were there in one of it, one of our UX critique meetings, and I don't remember, one of our UX designers had brought up a couple of designs of an IDE of sorts that was to be implemented in one of our product areas. And there was a code editor on one side with a clickable user interface on the other side. So you can change it on the code, or you could click on the user interface and it'll reflect on the code. So she was showing different designs of whether it should sit side by side, top and bottom, or it should be a screen of code editor, and then you press to get the clickable user interface. So it's different designs, and we were discussing on it, and we had different opinions, like user experience opinions versus developer experience opinions. So I don't remember what our conclusion was, but I remember the reasoning to the conclusion was we need to choose this over the other because this is what the developers are expecting. This is what they see in the industry. So they expect this. This is why we should choose
intuitive.
Yeah, so that's what is intuitive. So we need to adhere to a developer's mental model. So like you said, Budha, in terms of when you're using RStudio and you're crunching a lot of data, then maybe the mental model for that kind of an experience is maybe, say, 10, if it is 10 seconds, I don't know what the number is. If it's 10 seconds, then people probably expect, okay, 10 seconds is okay, 9 seconds is fine, 11 seconds is fine. But if it goes up to like 20 seconds, or if it finishes in like 2 seconds, then people are thrown off a bit. So yeah, adhering to mental models is, paving way for good developer experience.
Completely agree with that. There is a point that Phil has made here, which is essentially, I think, leads us very nicely to the next segment that I wanted to talk about, where he's talking about, we were thinking about quantifying productivity, enjoyment, success, and specifically enjoyment, and a developer satisfaction survey or a poll could potentially reach that, which actually leads me quite nicely to one of the things that people do get wrong sometimes with developer experience is the lack of feedback from real users, internal and external. So quite curious, I think, Yaara, if you've got a take on how to incorporate feedback into the overall process? Or rather, maybe let's start off with what the process looks like when it comes to when you are thinking or considering good developer experience or incorporating that into, say, the next product cycle, or any new release that's coming in. What does the process look like, and how does feedback feed into it?
We just had a few product managers that were actually doing some research, and they had this grid of I think it was how scared, like, what was the term? I forgot. Like time over how worried or concerned they were, basically, or how stressful level or something. And I thought, oh, we can actually connect them to measure their heart rate or something, and it could be more objective if we do that in the research. So this is how you nail down, and you can have like, okay, I want a lower heart rate with my products. Well,
I mean, fair enough, but I would imagine not having to strap on a few of those
I think
LED leads.
Well, we'll find solution, because the watch is doing that anyway. So it's only APIs to get the APIs from the iWatch.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Maybe an app for that.
Yes.
So anyway.
Yeah, the process.
Research. Yeah.
Research
so
process. Yes.
User research and DX collaborating since the very beginning. And everything we do is very much with the user research. The reason being is that developer experience joined a bit later, after the design of the product, and it's okay, because we needed to build a business. We also have user experience, and this new thing joined later on, and we always knew that, because I didn't say it before, but developer experience is not just one department. My job is actually to make sure everyone think about developer experience, because we are a team, so we do it together, and it's infusing this way of thinking to the product design. So back to user research, when we decide, like, okay, there is a problem, okay, something comes up, we need it, then we start thinking, what is it? What are the problems? Basically, we have objectives for the research, is to understand the user's pain and what the user is actually trying to do, not just give them solution. This is a tool, CLI, use it. No, we're trying to understand what kind of a CLI. Will the CLI help? CLI is imperative. Maybe we need to give them something declarative. In what stage are they within their user journey in the product? So we try to map their journey and see where the pain points in every place, and learn about that a lot before we kind of sometimes, as engineers, we always have at the back of our mind kind of something that we already think, but developing a product, even if it's a tool and it's smaller, costs a lot for the business. So we want to come with conscious mind to be sure that if we're going to start doing that, and we will have to support it because it's going to be amazing and people will ask for more, we need to make sure we actually want to do that at all, and it's worthwhile for the users and for the business. So yeah, we try to get as much data as possible and understand the business need and the users need, and from that we get to finding solutions and then planning. Then we try to do it in a very, like, it's very normal way. We try to do POC first to get the feeling, get sense of it internally. Then we create an MVP, again, check it internally. Then we will publish it outside, reach out in person to users that we work with, partners, clients that like to try bleeding edge, and get early feedback on that. And then we will start doing it a bit more officially. But with all that, we will still make sure that the product is testable and released, so people can really use it properly, and potentially maybe with Docker option if it's a tool, or if it's an API, then it should be released. All these ways, so the users that are testing us, it will be easy for them to actually do that.
And absolutely, I think you've described that feedback process and the overall process of DX quite well. I think the key thing again there is that the feedback loop does not end. Like just because you've launched a version of it, it does not
Right.
end. It's a very iterative process. You're looking at version, you're building on
Yes.
top of how things are going. It's a continuous cycle of testing, building, deploying, and then
It's all
testing
the
again.
time. That's part of the
Correct.
yeah. I think it's part of the product life cycle anyway.
Yeah.
To check with our users and to understand what they need. And part of it, because our users happen to be developers, then we need to look into that aspect very much.
And
Absolutely.
like adding
Yeah.
adding on to Yaara's point, like we think like it's a notion of the past to think that developers only think in 0 and 1 or black or white. They do care about the usability of the product and the discoverability. So at Tyke, we make sure that user experience and developer experience, it goes hand in hand. It's not one or the other, it's one and the other. And Tyke does it best by continuously mapping out our developer user journeys for our different product areas and getting constant user journey mapping feedbacks of the different product areas, reviews from relevant people, stakeholders through surveys and workshops. And the UX and DX team at Tyke, they work quite closely with each other, with Yaara's team, and bounce ideas off of each other. So I think that's how we make sure that we deliver a good developer experience for our products. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that leads us very nicely to the possibly the second big misconception. Maybe I would probably, in terms of priority, I would put it right at the top. But the one big misconception that people do have is that DX works in silo. So you can essentially think about DX in its own term, in its own box, and you have a team that is just working on the DX part of things, apparently, and that's it. But clearly, that is not the case. So when you're thinking about developer experience, when you're thinking about any product, you're thinking about the product, the process, and the people associated with it as a whole. And which is where I think when I initially introduced the stakeholders, we looked at developers who are building the APIs. There are the consumers, who are the users, who are going to be using those APIs. And then you've got the business or the API providers who are actually making that available, and the reason why that exists. So that's where I think the notion of the true intersection of 3 disciplines comes in. So obviously developer experience is one of them. Iris and Yaara, you've both spoken about user experience as being one of them. User experience, customer experience, potentially hand in hand there, specifically focusing on the end users and what value they are gaining from them. And then finally, it comes down to the even bigger picture is the whole reason for the existence of that API, which is the business objective behind it, which is the value exchange. That's kind of what the reason why the business is actually investing anything at all, any money, any resource at all in terms of making that available. It is something that's a value that they are probably receiving as a consequence. There's a reason why it exists, and the reason why that is being provided to those end users, perhaps. So I think that's something that people do get wrong. It's not a siloed thing. It's a combination of all of these 3 things put together.
Yeah, it's no one really, having a first class DX experience for a tool or a product that no one is using is like not a thing, right? It's nothing.
Exactly.
But also, on the other hand, no one actually wants a great product that is really pain to use. It used to be like that years ago because software development was a lot slower process and the expectations were different. So users were doing more. It was all local installation, for example, and it was completely different set of expectations. So I think that's why it goes hand in hand. But actually, if there's no consent in the business and you start working on DX and then the business shifts to another thing, then there's no point in that. So I think if you want to save money and trouble for everyone in the business, DX needs to work only on the business. What's the business wants, and not just any random choices, right? It's like, okay, if this is the product, like let's say docs are important. Okay, let's work on the developer experience of the docs. A certain product is important. Yeah, let's focus on that. If there's another like side project that we're still not sure, we might not invest in it at the moment and wait for it to get more traction and more complaints in a way, because you don't want to solve problems that no one cares about, right? You want to have an impact. And especially the business wants impact. And it makes sense. You need to provide, it needs to be, what I think the most important is that it needs to be win-win. It's not just the business makes money. It's both sides need to make to profit from this relationship. And that's the best way to do it. If users enjoy it and the way we deliver the product helps Tyke and as well as the users, that's a win-win. And I think that's the best situation to be in, rather than one way or another. So
absolutely, there is a best case scenario there, of course, where you're considering all of those three things together. But I would almost argue that if, for me, an API that is going to be, or a tool, I think, if I just reduce it to a tool at this point, a tool that is going to be bringing me some value, but has a terrible experience, I might still be more inclined to probably do that, because I think the why for me might matter, versus a tool that has a great experience.
Because you have to.
You have to, yeah. I mean, given that
You're
I don't
an
have any
audience
choice.
that cannot choose,
Yes.
It's
absolutely.
Yes, but there's like a famous saying by Steve Jobs that he says that you need to, what is it? That you need to start from the user experience or the customer experience and walk backwards to technology. Now, not everyone have the luxury to do that, because you need big pockets to be able to do that. You need a vision and money, sorry. You cannot have only vision, but you need money to sit aside and do that in the most perfect way. If we're realistic, it comes after, but it's okay, because you say, okay, users love the concept, they love the essence of what the value that we bring. Let's make it better experience. And it's kind of validation that we need to do that, right? Otherwise, there's no point in spending money on that, because it does cost. And I think we'll talk about that as well, right?
Absolutely. And I'm not going to the examples yet, but I think the thing that came to mind, because at the height of COVID, I was helping build this application which would help us analyze some of the COVID data. And with some of the government data that was coming in, it is very fragmented in the way in which it is actually made available. And over there, a lot of that documentation was available only in the form of PDFs, or even APIs. The data was locked within PDFs, which is a horrible, horrible way for you to interact with it. It's not interactive at all, to be fair. PDFs are not interactive by design. So, but
because
again,
it was done in a rush, right? Probably
yes.
in a rush, and it is what it is. Take it or leave it.
Exactly. So it's
at least there's an API.
And at least there's an API. And that's exactly the thing. I think a lot of times it comes down to, okay, at least we've got something, so might as well work with it. Whereas, with a more competitive situation where you do have others with access to data, I think then the conversation becomes a lot more an even playing field where, DX could be that differentiator. But in most cases, it's the holistic approach to that value exchange, to that user experience, and DX working together to providing that true value, to be that USP for that organization. One thing that I would probably want to go a little bit in more detail is around documentation, which is obviously a very important aspect of developer experience, because with developer experience, you've got, you need to have the ability to onboard developers easily without having to talk to people and getting, guides or consultants who are going to be walking you through steps. You should be able to do a lot of that yourself. And obviously the interface itself should be capable of, and as Iris mentioned, intuitive enough for you to follow along and accomplish your jobs to be done. But equally, in a lot of cases, there might be things that go beyond the basics. You go beyond the simple and you want to explore those things and be able to achieve this. That's where I think a lot of times documentation comes in, and really great documentation enables you to be better and more powerful with the tool in hand. Now, people do get stuff wrong with documentation as well. So curious to know, I think I gave one example already, which is one key problem or challenge with documentation can be if you have non-standardized formats that you are working with, where you're not really going with, say, the holy grail of things, which is open API specification. I think I do consider that as the holy grail, the biggest thing that you can do with your documentation to make it interactive and have a common language across the board is to go open API specification. But on the other end of the spectrum is a completely fragmented way of doing that, where you've got, a mix of PDFs, a mix of REST APIs, mixed of God knows what else, which is not properly documented. So curious to know, things that people, again, get wrong when it comes to documentation, and things that people should definitely do for great documentation experience for folks? Iris, Yaara, either one of you can answer this one, because I know both of you have touched documentation. It's been a big part of your
Iris
life.
is just really heavy on the documentation.
On documentation, just because I've been working on it for a while now. I feel like with documentation, especially when it's a company as technical as Tyke, so a developer documentation, is that it's important to keep in mind that when it comes to developer documentation, developers are a majority set of our users, but they are still just a portion of it. So there are others using our documentation as well in terms of maybe product managers, architects, and other people who may have a background in understanding in tech, but not work with the documentation on a daily basis. So then we'd have to consider user journeys other than our developers as well. And that makes it a bit tricky because we're looking at people who don't have the same expertise in technical expertise in terms like as the developers do, but they do still need to use the same documentation. So how do we design the documentation in such a way it's catering to expertise, different levels of technical expertise, or like whether or not they're familiar with the company's documentation? That's a different way to look at it. So yeah, I think that's something tricky. And right now, I think with Tyke, the fact that we have different product areas and we're offering it in different versions, there's different layers to our the information that we're trying to convey. That makes it quite tricky in terms of how we have to how we best put across our documentation. So I think one of the things that we're working on right now is the information architecture right now, and how we can best make it such that people are able to find it quicker. Or like, I think the documentation should essentially, like yesterday, Yaara and I were talking about the homepage of a documentation, and the homepage of a documentation should essentially be a map or a directory of the documentation, or lead users to where they want to go to. It's not just a marketing kind of a page. It's
like
should
the
have
mental model, right?
exactly.
The mental model of the users.
Yeah, it should be based on what users, or majority of the users, are expecting to see. That's what a documentation homepage, or developer documentation homepage, should look like. So I think, yeah, Yaara, do you have anything to add to how it gets tricky to navigate through developer documentation?
I think the challenge that you just mentioned here is very interesting, where once again, like you're talking about developer documentation, but you're also equally at the same time, you're talking about still having different stakeholders with different expectation and things that they want to extract out of it. So I think that's another place where people do have a bit of a misconception, because our own documentation has evolved over a period of time. And I think I'm not ashamed to say that. I think we've come a long way from where we were before, where I think we too started off with something which was a bit more specific to specific kinds of developers, where I think we assumed certain things from a knowledge-based perspective. Whereas I think right now it's moving towards a lot more holistic approach to documentation, where we are thinking about it from multiple levels. At least, again, that's my opinion of having looked at those documentation, that journey that has happened over the 3 years that I've been part of Tyke right now. That has come a long way, because it's not just about the developers. It's ultimately whoever is going to be interacting with your product in different capacities, they still have a job to be done that they are interested in. And for the documentation plus the tools, enabling them to accomplish that said job. I think that is the ultimate.
So we have like the people that are new starters, and then we have a deep dive, and people that already know Tyke and want to learn more and understand more. And we have also like section for product managers that want to understand concepts and ideas, and less development and engineering terms, but more what are we trying to achieve and how can we help them achieve their goals when they plan their projects. So I think this is what we want to do, and this way we will provide content to read and also technical guides and cover all our users. We found out that it's super important for users, although I want to say secretly that I want to make documentation redundant. If we can provide better product, better tools, we will be able, the users will need less of our documentation. Let's say maybe no need for getting started guide because it's so trivial. You know, obviously it's really something that it's like more like a vision than really a real thing. But really, if it's easy and you can do only a Docker Compose app, for example, when you get started, and it tells you everything that the tool itself shows you what to do, you know, you're in a really good place. So I think as in DX and in UX as well, the better we get, less words will need.
I've got an opinion on that. I think I honestly think that I don't see documentation going away. And the simple reason for that is I think it's not because I think our product is not going to improve. That is not the big reason. I feel like there is always going to be a complementary role between the two of them. Whereas I feel like what we would accomplish is that we will make the usual user journeys really, really intuitive, because I think that's something that we can think about, but there will still be those outliers, those specific cases, the custom requirements that people might still have.
But that's okay. Look, you can think about it like, you know, Google Analytics, okay? You don't need documentation to use Google Analytics, okay? Yeah. You start with it. When you get deeper into stuff, you might use documentation. So I think this is a good example for a good experience that it kind of leads you. And, you know, even when you plant documentation inside the product, so if you have a CLI and you can, instead of, obviously you can put in the CLI, you can put help, everyone knows that, but actually maybe you can click on a link that will open the browser for you with that page that you want, because it's nicer to read it in the browser. Or when you made the mistake in the CLI, it explains you what the mistake was, what are other possible options, and also gives you a link. And you don't have to Google for yourself. You get it already, because when you Google stuff, it takes more time, and you need to make decisions about which links to. First of all, which query to use to search, and then you need to choose the results, which one of the results. Obviously, you stay on the first page, but it's still not easy. And then maybe you readjust your search. We have the knowledge already, which page it is. Why not just give it? So these things will help. So we will use the documentation, but we want to infuse it into the product in a way that is really, you know, reduce frictions basically, and really enhance the productivity of the user.
I think hopefully with time, as our documentation gets better and better, we're hoping that there's lesser tickets for the support teams. So that's where we, as of now, want our documentation to reach.
Self-service, right? I think ultimately the goal is self-service with any tool, where you want less of human intervention as much as possible. Like I said earlier on, I don't want to be contacting a sales team or a commercial team or even an engineer to talk to. I just want to get done with it. Yeah, I want to get done with it. I want to be able to explore it myself. I want to be able to get to those answers myself. And I think that self-service is very, very important in today's world, especially as a developer, where I really hate talking to people, emailing people. I do not enjoy that at all. Thankfully, I'm an evangelist.
Or it's the weekend.
Or it's the weekend. You know? Well, people may not be available. Absolutely. So you are absolutely right. And one other thing that I think that people do get wrong with some of this stuff, especially now that if you go into the territory of niche requirements almost, where your tool is capable of handling your usual user journeys and getting your initial jobs to be done, you want to go deeper. I think that's where sometimes people go wrong with documentation, where there is a lack of examples. I think that can be very, very problematic, because for me, I think when I'm trying to explore something, for me to having to figure out what is happening or figure out what is the right request to make to get some response back, when again I'm in the exploratory phase, can be a bit of a challenge for me. And I think that might again put me off. So having that really strong examples that you could give me to say, okay, if you do this, this is what you're going to get. This is what an error looks like. So that holistic documentation can be really, really powerful. And sometimes people—
It is part of the Open API spec.
Exactly.
It's part of the Open API spec. And also we have in the docs, or even if we use curl, we always put the response. And I can mention also we have a VS Code extension. So you can use Tyke with IntelliSense, and basically it auto-completes everything for you. And this has actually also examples in it. So with just control space, you get a whole example of API definition or a key or a config file, just like that. And you just need to tweak it to your needs. So within seconds in your environment, you get this example, because that was a pain for me as well. Like, I want to use the open source gateway. I need to write it myself. So it's a bit confusing, copying it from the documentation and then put it there. And it's like, I have too many stuff. So now you can just install the extension and you get this straight away. You get error detection, validations of the JSON, and it's so much easier when you have an example. Exactly.
Yeah. And again, it's making life easier, right? Because ultimately, we talk about this thing called time to value, and I think that probably means different things to different people. But for developers, time to value for me is having to spend less time fighting with the tool and more time actually building the application and the product, right?
Yes.
So for me, if for instance, a Helm chart, which is a beautiful thing, by the way, Helm chart is going to help me get it all up and running and set up with all of the different components working cohesively. And then I can just get to that hello world almost instantaneously, probably not instantaneously as much, but in a very, very short period of time. Then that to me is a success. That is a successful story of great user onboarding as part of your developer experience. So
and
that to me is
if you combine it, for example, with Tyke operator, you don't even need to think about the CI/CD pipeline. You have everything in Git, all the APIs. Every time you need to change this, you test it in your dev environment, but then you put it in Git and it gets updated and synced to your dashboard. And it makes life so much easier. It's really, really nice experience.
And I think we've already walked into this territory, which was going to be the next segment. We've already walked in the territory of examples of good and bad DX almost. So we've spoken a little bit about, things where documentation hasn't really lived up to it. One horrible, painful thing that I think we had to deal with was PDF-based APIs, which I did not know was a thing, but it was horrible to work with, but it is a thing across a lot of government data. It still exists in those kind of silos where it's digitized because it's in a PDF format, but it is not digitized because it's not really interactively accessible. So that to me is horrible. I wouldn't call it even DX, but horrible documentation, and you should probably sort that out. But curious to know from your experiences, maybe we'll start off with you, Iris, in terms of good developer experience that you've seen in the wild, and perhaps one bad, and maybe we'll discuss that.
I think I don't have any new examples other than the tons that we've already talked about, but I think I've been seeing a lot of good documentation examples lately. But in terms of like I said earlier, I think like paving way for good developer experience would be adhering to developer mental models, like I mentioned earlier, like making sure what the products that we're creating is what they're familiar with and keeping with industry standards, and they find it intuitive. Like even like naming conventions, if we use names for things that are names differently for things that are something else in the industry, that throws people off. They don't know what we're talking about. So I think that adhering to mental models paves way for good developer experience, and if we don't, it completely throws them off. So yeah.
And I'll give you a very, very, very simple example of that, where you've got when you're thinking about API security, you're thinking about authentication tokens. In the request headers, you would put authorization, and that simple spelling of authorization with a Z in there versus the spelling of authorization with an S can trip people up sometimes. So, just that simple little thing sometimes, whether you're using the British English or the US version, which is what the actual header name is with the Z, that can throw people off as well. So I think that convention, the predictable nature, I think that's a very important thing. The predictability of what an API is going to do today, tomorrow, day after, and keeping that consistent is very, very important. That you're not coming in for surprises. Surprises are great for holidays, for gifting. When it comes to APIs and coding, that is not where you want to be surprised from.
Developers want surprises. I don't think developers want surprises like that. And I think I guess it comes down to all humans. Like everyone wants what they're familiar with. No one wants to be thrown off by any surprise. surprise where they're expecting something to be a certain way. So yeah.
Absolutely. Yaara, any examples from your end in terms of, some of the goods and the not so goods?
I have two.
Okay, go on.
One is a generic one that sometimes products, there's like the error handling is not great in terms of just tell me what it is, tell me what the value is. And it actually applies even to application logs. I'm running an application now. So I'm a user of the application. I bought it, for example, or even if it's an open source. And I need to actually go and change the code to print values that I really need. So I think we need to, when writing application logs, for example, or a CLI, we need to really be helpful for the user and give them as much as information as they need to be able to correct that. That's in general. And I have one example of bad developer experience from the time I was a C++ developer, and I was using a library to basically, when you create a server or a client in Go, it's so easy. I was just surprised. But in C++, it's so tedious. Like you have you have a socket and you need to bind to it, and then you need to listen, and then you need to accept, have a loop to accept, and then you have this send receive loop. So there's a loop and another loop, and you need to check all the time when you read, if you read everything, and when it's finished, when you finish actually, and it's very complicated to make sure you're doing it right, even though you have function libraries to do everything and connect to the actually even lower functions in the C level. So this was really bad and error-prone user experience. Yeah.
I mean, the challenge there is obviously different languages were built to do different things. And I think that's where that can be a bit of a challenge, where I think sometimes people tend to try and fit in languages to do things that they were never really intended to do. And I feel like C and C++ kind of sometimes suffer from that because they weren't really meant for the web as much. I think that's where the more modern languages have come in.
Well, C++, I don't think C++ servers will go away anytime soon. They are the bare bone of the internet, and yes, they are the browsers, but they're also many times are servers, and it's not fun. And I think that's why I'm sure that today there are better libraries than it was a few years back. Yeah.
And I think that's where also the evolution and the history of a technology also comes into play, right? Because when something was created back then, the use case might have been completely different. The intention behind building that programming language might have been completely different. And as other things, because I think when C++ came in, web itself was not really as big a thing. The internet itself wasn't as big a thing at that point of time. So that evolution has again led to the need for adoption or adaptability of C++ has changed because of that. And that's where I think, like you say, libraries have come up and which are enabling some of those things. But the original intention of C++ was very, very different, where it was an iterated version with the ++ over C, introducing concepts of object-oriented programming, introducing objects and how the encapsulation works.
Web server and backend server is very different. So
yes, absolutely.
Yeah, in terms of implementation.
Absolutely.
But let's not go into that now.
Yeah, true. Because C++ was one of my early languages as well. So I think for me, that was, it brings back a lot of memories that I'd built back-end systems with that, but not used it ever for the web. So one example that I will bring in before we go into our final question was, it's pretty much the holy grail at this point. I think everyone looks up to this as an example, which is Stripe and the developer experience that goes with working with Stripe APIs. There is a very clear value exchange that comes up with Stripe, where for the organization, it's about making payments available, but at the same time having the ability to take a certain percentage in terms of transaction fees that will enable their business to make money potentially. And again, money is not always the case for value exchange. And then the other side of the spectrum, where the end users, for the user experience, they are looking at how do we pay for things in a simplified manner? How do we make sure that if there is transactions to be done, it's done in a simplified, scalable, predictable way? And that's what, again, Stripe APIs are enabling for developers. Again, it's very well documented. It's a tool that's fairly intuitive, so you can go over and build out your products quite easily. It's easy to integrate into your product.
I think if you can describe it in English, it means you can do it.
Yeah.
Like if you have words for it to say, you can do it. You can make API of it and automate it.
Absolutely. So I think that would be my example there. The final question, I think, that I feel like we've gone over things a little bit already, where we've spoken about some of the bad, some of the good, some of the things that people are getting wrong. But I think the key thing for everyone to understand is that there is a cost involved. There's a cost involved to build things, and there's a cost involved for getting DX wrong. So curious again, Yaara, from your perspective, what is that cost of bad DX, and how badly does that impact an organization?
Well, there is this immediate bad DX, like when it's not good. Like I think now we're improving, for example, our documentation. Documentation is really, really important part in our sales process. So it's really crucial for us that our users that just, they don't even know us will have amazing experience and will struggle as much less as possible. So that's one aspect, that immediate cost. And also there are lots of other aspects related to the actual how you manage business. So when you can always throw another tool, but actually you need to make sense of all these tools, and that's not easy, and you could actually confuse the users even more. So you want to have at least some consistent experience across all your APIs, across all your tools, and CLIs, for example. You don't want one CLI to function in a different way. And we actually have a solution for that we will share soon. Other aspects that also these tools need maintenance. That means more time spent on, like it's like the product. You need to maintain it. You also need team to work on it and manage it. It's like any other product. Once you get to day 2, it costs. It's not just one-off.
And I think there are two aspects there as well. I think we've already spoken about the money aspect of things, where, things cost money and time and resources, right? So there is that aspect, you're building something. If it's not valuable, then, what is the point of doing that? Again, you're maintaining something that is not great. So there is that money and resource aspect. But equally, there is a reputational aspect as well, because the developer community, there's a lot of developers, but then the community itself is very close-knit. The word of mouth spreads very, very quickly. So if something is great, that spreads really quickly. If something is bad, then that spreads equally quickly. And it's a sure shot way to end up losing your end users and developers from actually adopting your product. If reputationally you've not spent enough time, that's the true reputational cost of DX, or bad DX, where the word has spread that it's very hard for us to work with Tyke, and therefore we would use a competing product, for instance, because it's just making life easier, or vice versa, for instance, that they're you coming to Tyke because the alternatives are horrible.
It's horrible way, and it can really destroy all the other efforts, right? If someone would say that.
I don't want to be fighting with my tools. That's the ultimate thing. It's meant to help me. It's kind of like, if I'm a superhero, my weapon of choice, or Thor's hammer, for instance, is going to help me be better at being a superhero. That's what I want to do. That's what tools are meant to enable. So I think, to me, that's kind of the take that I take. Iris, any final words of wisdom before we close this session today?
Final words of wisdom, huh?
Key takeaways would do as well, or something that you would want people to, if there was one thing that you wanted people to take away from today's session, what would you recommend that to be?
I think that one key takeaway for people, or I'd like people to take away, is that it's common for people to think that DX and UX are quite separate, but it's almost goes hand in hand. And I think it's quite important for people to remember that, especially in a very technical company like Tyke, that it's not separate. So
Absolutely. All right. My key takeaway would be, consider things holistically. It is not isolated. You need to be able to collaborate. You need to be able to get the right feedback from people on an ongoing basis, and understand the true value of why the API exists, what the API is providing to all of its stakeholders, and how you can get to that time to value in the fastest and the shortest possible time for your developers. So that is my key takeaway out of this.
Adding
Yaara,
like
sorry, go on.
all three, like the developers, the stakeholders, as well as the end users, like you said earlier, having all three in the loop. Yeah, that's quite important.
Alrighty. Yaara, closing words at all here? Do DX well.
No, actually, there's something I totally agree with what you said, that we're one team, so that's important, and you need to get business consent and work on what's important. There's one thing I wanted really to find a way to add to this, just as what I forgot the right words. I just wanted to mention, maybe, so it will open in a conversation in future Hangouts.
Sure.
And it's something that we're working on in tech, and something I've been thinking a lot about and would like to hear other people's opinion about. And it's, how do I do in a company and APIs and SDKs and CLIs in an efficient way? I can do it manually, but can I do auto-generate it or not? We are hitting some walls, and we're still thinking how to do it in an efficient way, not just, vomit it, because SDK is quite easy to generate. But as I mentioned, in day two, it's hard. So if you have updates, what do? Same with APIs. You have update to the API or updating the code in some way. So all this concept is very complicated. We haven't touched it at all. And it's an important aspect because it does fall under the DX. So that's what I've been thinking about in the last few months, and will continue.
Right. Absolutely. I think like you hit the nail on the head. I think that's a topic for it's a teaser for perhaps a future session for sure, because there is always going to be that conversation. How do you once again balance out between what's auto-generated, what needs to be done manually, where does that human interaction, human intervention, where is that needed? Because some of these things need to be smartly managed versus just done as part of a workflow, perhaps. So
it needs
definitely
to work
a topic.
as part of the business. So yeah.
Correct. Absolutely. So thank you so much. I think that's been a fantastic session. We are at time at this point. So incredible conversation. There's a lot of key takeaways. I would love to summarize all of this, probably a blog post at some point coming in as well. Thank you for sharing your experience and your opinions here, Yaara and Iris. I completely enjoyed this session. There's so much for me to learn as well as an evangelist and as a developer. I'm looking forward to working with tools that are suited to my own mental model and making my life easier. So thank you so much, everyone. This has been fantastic. Until next time, take care and see you later.
Pleasure to be here. Bye.
Bye-bye.